To Bobby, we want to let you know that we are recording the presentation, and we ask that everyone mute their microphones and headsets. And if Bobby, if anyone has questions, we're going to have them type it into the chat area at the bottom of the screen. And then Bobby, at the end of this, you can field those questions. Right now I'm going to have Greg introduce our speaker, Bobby Caputo.
So without further ado, I would like to introduce Bobby Caputo. Bobby is the co-founder of PTA Global Academy, an internationally renowned speaker, author, consultant, known to produce high-performance groups by utilizing a dynamic and provocative presenting style. He has developed and inspired thousands of trainers, managers, and industry leaders to facilitate remarkable change in their business through communication and an understanding of the forces that facilitate change. Bobby has held various positions such as personal trainer, fitness manager, membership sales consultant, area director, corporate training, and development director, as well as director of professional personal development for the National Academy of Sports Medicine. I will now go ahead and transfer the presentation over to Bobby. Enjoy, guys.
All right, Bobby, I'm getting this over to you. All right, Bobby, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Sharon, and thank you for everybody who's attending this right now. Back in the Renaissance period in Italy, they were building a magnificent cathedral. This is one of the major shifts in architecture, going from utilitarian to more of something that was aesthetically beautiful. This cathedral would not only be a place of spiritual leadership, but this would also be an opportunity to showcase the engineering of Italian design. One summer day, in the midst of the construction project, it was especially hot. As a matter of fact, it was brutally hot, and it was humid, and you could barely breathe. The air was so thick, and it was the middle of the day, and these group of laborers, these stone cutters, had been working since the sun came up, and they were going to be working until the sun went down much later that evening. If you took a look at these laborers, what they were doing was simple. They were breaking these big round stones and chiseling them with painstaking labor and precision into perfectly shaped bricks that would build part of the wall that would one day make up this cathedral. And it was a beautiful sight because when you looked at them, they were all hunched over. Their faces were bright red. Sweat was pouring off of their face, off of their body, pooling onto the ground below. And walking through the courtyard at this specific time was a priest. And he looked at the intense labor that the men were engaged in. And out of curiosity, he walked over to one of the laborers and put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Son, what are you doing?" Well, the man's face was downtrodden. He didn't even look up. And he just mumbled underneath his breath, "I'm cutting stone." Well, that bit was kind of obvious. So, a bit discouraged, the priest thought, "I'll give this one more try." And he sought out at random another laborer, and he approached the man, put his hand on his shoulder, gently interrupting his work, and said, "Tell me, what are you doing?" The man looked up and he had this unbridled passion in his face. He dropped his tools on the floor. He rose to his feet and almost astonished at the question, he pointed to at what that time was nothing more than a stacked pile of bricks and said, "Can't you see, man? I am building a magnificent cathedral in the service of my God and my country." Wow. Now, that was profound. Because here are two men doing the same exact work, probably for the same exact pay, putting in the same number of hours, It is brutally hard for both of them. One is nothing more than a mere stonecutter. The other one is a visionary, magnificent cathedral builder, and the only point of differentiation between the two individuals is clarity. It's not about getting more done. Anyone can succumb to the temptation to put down on a list 47 things that we need to do in a day and neurotically and frenetically work through that list. That might make you more efficient. It doesn't make any of us more effective. It might make us busy. It doesn't make us productive. And very often there's confusion between the two. The starting point of time management is clarity. So ask yourself this question. My company is. What is it? What does it produce? What does it do? Not just health and fitness, but what does that mean? What are the tangibles? What are the deliverables, and more important, nobody cares what our company is, but rather what the company does. So the most important thing my company does is, and come up with 1 to 2 answers to that question. But never more than that. Because if it doesn't make sense to us, and if it does not explode in our mind, meaning when we hear it, we don't say, wow, what a great idea. I can't believe I didn't think of that sooner, or I can't believe I didn't think of it, well then it's not going to explode in the mind of our customer either. One of my favorite speakers in the world is the owner of IDEO. His name is Professor Gary Hamel. In Fortune magazine, in the June 2000 edition, he wrote, create a cause, not a business. So identify your company's purpose. In other words, what one goal, if we were to accomplish, would have the greatest benefit and enable all of our other goals to be achieved. When stating a goal, we want to be idealistic at this point, not realistic yet. We could put foundations under it, but most of all, put it in writing. Back in the Korean War, high-ranking officials within the U.S. military were captured and imprisoned. Now, just a few years earlier, they had been trained to resist interrogation based on the standards of war that was employed in World War II. In other words, these high-ranking officials, because they contained so much sensitive information, faced the high likelihood that if captured, they would be severely tortured. And they were trained how to resist torture for as long as possible, because everyone cracks, it's just a matter of when, in order to divulge as little information as possible. But in the Korean War, the methods that were employed were quite unusual. The Koreans employed a technique we now know as brainwashing. And what they would do is when a high-ranking United States officer was captured, they would imprison them and make them suffer through days of sleep deprivation, which is brutal. And then in a state of sleep deprivation, when their logic and reasoning capacity was lowered, after days, and days might have seemed to these people like months, it might have seemed like years, they were in a cold, dark, damp cell, deprived of sensory stimuli that they could use to discern how much time had passed. And finally, the door would swing open and there would be a blinding light, and 2 soldiers would collect them and bring them down a very, very dark, wet alleyway. And inside the POW's mind, he would be preparing for severe torture. And then he was brought to a door, and the door was opened, and to his surprise, it was not a torture chamber. It was a well-decorated, very nicely furnished room with a smiling gentleman, a Korean officer at the other end of the table. And there was music playing in the background, and it was American music. And they would sit down, and they would have a conversation. The conversation would start out by the Korean officer informing the American officer that they did not share, obviously, the same ideology. However, it was their governments that was at war, not each other personally. And he would even inform him that he had read all about the United States and was a big fan. Everything seemed so magical, so big there. And he would talk about the benefits of a capitalist society. And then he would ask, the high-ranking POW officer a question. Is it true, because I've heard, that in such a wealthy nation, there are actually homeless people on the streets of every major city? Now, even if the officer did not answer, in his mind, he had to concede that that was true. And then the Korean officer would say something quite intelligent. He would say something to the effect of, well, even though I believe in my system, capitalism seems to have many benefits. It's a good system. He wouldn't attack it. But he would say, if it produces homeless people, it doesn't work for quite everybody. Well, that again is a reasonable statement. And then after a long period, they would get into a conversation about the pros and, of course, the cons of capitalism. And the officer would suggest that the American POW looked quite tired, which was absolutely true. And he was very interested in picking up the conversation because he was fascinated by it, but he was very busy. Would the POW mind just writing down some of the things that they discussed on paper before he went for a much-needed period of rest? Now, this was called brainwashing because when somebody wrote it down, they could not deny their statements. They couldn't go back and say, well, no, that wasn't quite right. It was in their own handwriting. And this employed the principle of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the emotional duress that we suffer from holding two opposing viewpoints in mind. We strive, as our greatest benefit and our greatest liability, to be consistent with everything that we say and do in the present with everything that we have said and done in the past. So write down the answers to these questions. What one goal, if accomplished, would have the greatest benefit and enable other goals to be achieved? And when you put it in writing, you now have a clear statement of fact that activates cognitive dissonance on a behavioral level in your favor. Next, if you had unlimited funding in your company, or if you personally had won the lottery and time and money were no longer a factor, what exactly would you do within your career? If Club Business International, which is kind of like the Fortune magazine for the fitness industry put out by URSA, were to write a story about you 10 years from now and the legacy and the achievements that you and your company had accomplished, what would that article say? And what would you attempt to do, you and your company, if you knew you could not fail? And finally, what is it that you personally love to do? If you did not need the money and you could do anything, what one activity, professional or personal, gives you the greatest feeling of elation, passion, ecstasy? And what gives you the greatest feeling of professional pleasure, self-worth, and fulfillment? See, if we can answer these questions, we identify exactly what it is we love to do and what we should be doing every day, because we are only at our most creative, we're only at our most ingenious, we only employ the highest levels of our personal ingenuity and commitment when what we do is in perfect alignment with what it is we value. See, we can get more stuff done and produce average results, but average results have below average rewards because the two forces each of us are facing in today's society is growing choice and demand, the growth of information and the growth of competition. So here's a couple of action steps. On your free time, list everything we, meaning you and your company and your team, because there's absolutely no such thing as a self-made man or woman, but in this case, let's say you would like to achieve within 5 years. Now organize that list in order priority from the greatest to least. Now take the top 5. Let's say you've written down 20 things. Transfer the top 5 onto a separate sheet of paper and then ask if we, or I, could accomplish just one single goal on this list. What would it be and why? And if you could only accomplish one more goal, what would that be and why? The next step is to write down 10 action steps to achieving each goals, determining which actions should be delegated to other team members based on their individual capabilities, and which action steps on that list, given your area of interest, your skill sets, your experience, and your innate talents, can only be done in an excellent fashion by you. When I was younger, I used to hate what I call old films. I love them now. I have a massive appreciation for the art of classic cinema, if you call it that. But when I was younger, I hated it. And I was literally forced by my stepfather one day on a Saturday to sit down with him and watch the film Spartacus with Kurt Russell. And many of you have seen this film, and others have no idea what I'm talking about. But Spartacus was a film that was loosely based on a true story of Roman gladiator slaves forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of the people in the Colosseum, who finally had enough, and under the leadership of Spartacus, launched a rebellion and defeated the Roman legions twice. Now, this is astonishing because here were not professionally trained soldiers. They were slaves. They were gladiators who defeated, at that time, the most highly trained, brutal fighting force that ever existed. And relatively speaking, the Roman Empire probably still is one of the greatest military forces that had ever existed since documented history. So the Senate started to get quite nervous, because if these slaves could defeat the Roman legions twice, what's to stop them from advancing forward and eventually marching on the capital of Rome itself? So they recruited the efforts of rogue Roman general Marcus Licinius Cassius, who had quite unconventional and, to be honest, brutal means of subduing his enemies. And at the end of the film, nearing the climax, you see Spartacus's army defeated, laid out in front of General Marcus Licinius Cassius. And he makes them an offer. If they gave up Spartacus, he promised them a quick and relatively painless execution. Now, that doesn't sound like a very good deal so far, but listen to the alternative. If they failed to give up Spartacus, he promised each of Spartacus's soldiers the most horrific execution allowed by Roman law, death by crucifixion. And a few moments pass, and there's absolute silence. And then a scene that has been referred to so many times in cinema that it's nearly a cliche, played out in front of the audience. Kirk Douglas, playing the role of Spartacus, defiantly and bravely rises to his feet and declares, "I'm Spartacus." And then the person sitting next to him stands up within a moment and defiantly declares, "No, I'm Spartacus." And then another man rises to his feet and declares, "No, I'm Spartacus." And within moments, Spartacus's entire army is defiantly on their feet. And even though I hated old films as a child, I looked at the TV and I thought to myself, wow, they must really love this man. Look at what they're willing to sacrifice for him. And I didn't get it till much later in life that even though by defying General Licinius Cassius, they accepted death by crucifixion, they weren't loyal to Spartacus the man, but they were loyal to the vision that Spartacus represents. The idea that one day they could be free. And they had the confidence in their ability to actualize that vision because they had defeated the Roman legions twice. It was possible. And at that point, relinquishing that vision was more painful than any other alternative any of the men could imagine in their mind, even more painful than death by crucifixion. And I think that is the starting point of fulfillment. Not necessarily when we achieve something out there, but when we internalize in our mind a vision that is so powerful, not only for us, but it galvanizes the hearts and minds of other people to the degree that to sacrifice that vision would cause each of us to suffer a loss that is more painful than any other alternative. That is when we have passion, willpower, discipline, and that is when all of the attributes that we equate with bringing our future vision into our current reality occur automatically. So visualize exactly what your career, your company looks like. What is your reputation? What is your profit? What is your assets, innovations, contributions, 10 years, 5 years, 1 year from now? What steps did you take to get there, starting from today forward? And create at least 3 future alternatives. Jack Welch, the legendary CEO of General Electric, used to have a methodology for interviewing people. See, Jack Welch felt that one of his primary responsibilities was to personally recruit every high-level executive, regardless of how busy he was, regardless of how much he had going on within the organization. And he would ask his executives a question on an interview. It's a question we've all heard. So tell me, what specifically is your 5-year plan? Any person applying for a high-level executive position who had the answer to what exactly is your 5-year plan was dismissed immediately. They weren't even considered for employment because Jack Welch felt that either they were completely full of crap or they were delusional. And there was no place in GE for an individual like that because Jack Welch believed that given the high rate of change in GE, a company that he took from a $17 billion a year company to a $500 billion a year company before he handed the reins over to Jeff Imlett back in 2001. He believed that in a company like that, you don't know what's going to happen 5 weeks from now, sometimes 5 days from now. So whatever your vision is for the future, you better have an alternative because the future you imagine isn't necessarily always the future that's going to manifest. Next, 6 keys to goal achievement. One is creating a clear mental picture of your goals already achieved. Now, what has happened, forget about what you don't want to have happen, but what has happened in clear present state language, and if you accept 100% responsibility for the achievement of your goals, act as if it were impossible to fail. Now, you're going to make lots of mistakes along the way. As a matter of fact, you'll probably screw more things up than you achieve more things, but that's the process of learning, growth, and reinvention. And when you fail, learn from it, embrace it, because failure begats success. And do something to move you in the direction of your goals every day. See, what's really important is to identify, even if I have 10 things on my list, what one thing, if I could do today, would account for the greatest value, not only in my life, but in my company and in the lives of my client and all stakeholders. Because what we do daily determines who we become permanently. So if we want to leave a legacy, we have to live a legacy daily. And sometimes it's not a matter of doing more things, but doing more important things. Douglas K. Smith, in his book, Making Success Measurable, a mind book workbook for setting goals and taking action, talks about being smart. At the PT Academy Global Certification, we talk about SMART goals in terms of, firstly, be specific. The more specific the goal, the more directed the action plan. Next, be measurable. Break the goal into smaller subunits and evaluate regularly if you're producing the desired result. Back in the late 1800s, Thomas Edison had stolen a patent from Sir Joseph Swan. A year earlier, Sir Joseph Swan had invented the light bulb, but he made one critical error. He used a platinum-impregnated filament, which meant the light bulb didn't burn long enough to be commercialized or mass-produced. Now, Thomas Edison, who's credited for inventing the light bulb, even though he didn't, did do something rather clever. He saw a massive commercial opportunity, and it's reported that he did over 10,000 very specific, long, painstaking experiments and failed repeatedly in finding which type of filament would allow the light bulb to burn long enough to be commercialized. And somewhere around his 5,000th failure, a very young Napoleon Hill, who was on project from at that point in time one of the richest men in the world, Andrew Carnegie, went to interview Thomas Edison for what would later become the material for his book, Think and Grow Rich. Now, Napoleon Hill had asked Thomas Edison, how is it that you keep on keeping on in this ridiculous experiment when you failed over 5,000 times? Edison laughed at him. He said, young man, you simply do not understand the way the world works. I never once failed. I have successfully identified 5,000 ways not to commercialize the light bulb. Eventually, if I keep failing, I'm going to run out of things that don't work, and the one solution remaining will be the correct solution. And that solution was the carbon-impregnated filament, which is what created the modern light bulb today. So the next step is achievable. An achievable goal is judged by the detailed plan of its achievement. However, the greater the goal and the desire, the greater the motivation. And is it relevant? See, a lot of times we, as I said before, confuse productivity with mobility. If you ever ask someone how they're doing, the old answer used to be fine, and they would just get on with it. Now if you ask someone, hey, how's it going? The answer they seem almost obligated to give you is busy, very, very busy, doing lots and lots of stuff. Doing lots of stuff doesn't mean doing the right stuff. So is the goal that I'm working on something that matches my vision, my company's vision, and its stated priorities and strategic initiatives? And next is set timelines and sub-timelines for everything. Remember, a goal without a deadline is just a conversation, and everything takes longer than expected. Any of you that have ever been involved in a health club build-out know that all too well. So, Murphy's Law, this is the thing that we hate to talk about because we say, well, it's negative, and it's not negative, it's reality. What obstacles or possible obstacles can prevent us from achieving our biggest goals? List them and identify what is necessarily the biggest and what is the limiting step. Now, I don't know where you're listening in from. You might be listening in from New York, Los Angeles. You might be sitting on the motorway right now on your smartphone on the M25. But wherever you're listening in from, if you're living around a major city, you've dealt with traffic. Now, in Los Angeles, in the United States, there are massive 5-lane highways or motorways, and they're just unprecedented. These things are huge. And very often, there's a famous highway called the 405. It's pretty much a parking lot most of the day. And let's say you're driving through on the 405 and traffic's just flowing and it's going really well and you're going, wow, I'm so lucky, barely any traffic. But then up ahead you see everything start to slow down to a halt because they closed off 4 lanes and they just left 1 lane open to pass through. Well, it doesn't matter how smoothly traffic is flowing up until that point. Your ability to get from where you are to where you're going in an expeditious fashion is directly dependent on how effectively you move through that 1 lane or that bottleneck. That lane becomes the rate limiting step. So what is the limiting step, or what could the limiting step be, and how can we alleviate it? What knowledge, resources, skills, and experience do we need to achieve this goal? Do we need to bring in someone who specializes in marketing? Do we need more motivation? Do we need a more clearly defined mission statement that galvanizes people within our teams? Do we need more leadership, strategic planning, organizational development, and so on? And who do we need both inside and outside the company to help us achieve this goal? And finally, who or what can make it hard for us to achieve this goal? Peter Drucker, who is probably one of the greatest consultants of the 20th and may as well be one of the greatest consultants of the 21st century, in his 60-year career, got more stuff right than most other consultants. And we're talking about this in a day and age where consultants seemingly outnumber the workforce, basically. And he said action without planning is a major reason for failure. So continually ask ourselves every single week, and perhaps every single day in our highest priority tasks, what am I trying to do? How am I trying to do it? Could there be a better way? And that's a hard question to ask, because a lot of times we're not only attached to our outcomes because we're passionate about what we do, we're passionate about who we do it for, and we're passionate about the level of identity we have in our industry. So our industry and our career isn't something we do. It literally becomes the epitome of who we are. So could there be a better way is painful sometimes because we become attached to methodology. But it is a critical question nonetheless. And what are our most important goals, and are they still important? And why? Johann Wolfgang von Goethe said that things that matter most should never be at the mercy of things that matter least. List all of your tasks, and this is easy to do with an iPhone or a smartphone, on a master appointment log. So in other words, go back to your goal, your single most important goal that you said you were going to accomplish this year, and transfer the items down to what tasks will take you a year to complete, a month, weekly, and what must you do daily. So make monthly, weekly, and daily to-do lists, and we're going to organize that in terms of priority. And again, I cannot understate this. It's not about more. It's a matter of alignment. Michael Dale says it's easy to decide what you're going to do. The hard thing is deciding what you're not going to do. And I think that is absolutely true, because in time management, it's not just a matter of identifying priorities, but rather posteriorities. Not only what are we going to do today, but really effective people I've seen, I believe, are individuals who decide, what am I not going to do today? They're the individuals that have the ability to discern the urgent from the important, and they're not necessarily the same. There are two management systems that we could talk about. If you're more linear, you could use number A, or letter A rather, the ABTC, the ABCDE, or if you're more conceptual, the Covey quadrant system. Let's start with the more linear one. Let's say you have a list of 10 things that you need to accomplish today. Well, all tasks are not equal. A stands for action immediately. These are the things that absolutely cannot wait. An example of this might be training a client. B is before the end of the day. What are things that you could put off, but not for long, and has to be accomplished before the end of the day? And the key is, never do a lower value task at the expense of a higher value task just to get it off your list, because it's impossible to do all of the things you need to do, especially when we are getting busier and busier and being more and more inundated with sensory information, emails, social media than any time in history ever before. So C is can wait. These are the things that you can choose to ignore for now. D is delegate. Is there anyone within your team, within your network, within your circle of influence that is better suited to do this than you are? For example, I work with someone who I consider to be brilliant. His name is Michel Dalcourt. Now, me and Michel have very different areas of specialization. So if he wants information on behavior modification and coaching, he'll pick up an article in the airport in Scientific American Mind, let's say, and I'll say, Bobby, could you just read through this magazine and give me a synopsis on which one of these points would be most relevant to me? Now, because I understand who he is, his company, and what he's trying to do, what he speaks on, I can easily pull out 2 to 3 key points with action items that he can use later. And I do the same with him with human movement science. So D stands for delegate, and E stands for eliminate. And here's a great question for the E. What would happen? What would be the worst possible outcome if I chose to ignore this task completely? What if I didn't do it at all? And a lot of times you'll see that plan procrastination or elimination, if the answer to what's the worst case scenario is nothing too catastrophic at all, it might be better to eliminate that task and not let it bind you up and interfere with other things that are critically important. Now, if you have a paper and pen in front of you, draw a box and break that box into 4 sub-boxes, creating a quadrant. The late, great Stephen Covey talked about this quadrant system in terms of things that were urgent and important, urgent yet not important yet urgent, and activities that were neither urgent nor important. Let me give you an example of each. Things that are urgent and important are things that have high consequences if they're ignored and yield high levels of benefit to you, to your company, to your clients when they are done. An example of something that is urgent and important could be how you handle a session with a client. An example of something that is not urgent but is very important is continual training and development, reading, listening to audio programs, going to conferences, studying, constantly increasing your level of expertise and proficiency within your area of competence. Now, you don't have to do this right now, obviously. You might not even have to do it today. But compound episodes of neglect can be catastrophic because information is changing almost daily, and I'm only being slightly facetious. An example of something that is urgent yet not important is a member slips and falls and needs immediate attention. Now, this is not going to move your career forward, but you have to address it straight away because while this isn't important for your career, the person's very important. Another example of this could be a ringing telephone with somebody who's really important on the other end, and you have to get it right now, although the conversation might not yield high consequences in a residual fashion throughout your career. It might not increase the positioning and the branding of your company, but it has to be taken. And examples of things that are neither important nor urgent is junk email. We'll talk about that. That's one example of things that just simply waste our time, but are quite time-consuming. So here's a self-assessment. What, in your opinion, are your unique talents and strengths? What do you do especially well? As a matter of fact, what is it that you do so well that other people, when they apply equal effort and they apply equal hours in this one area, doesn't seem to quite perform anywhere near your level of proficiency? And what do you credit for all the success you've had so far? Ask yourself, do I accept responsibilities where I know I could perform to distinction? One of the hardest things in our career and in our day is saying no. And there are a lot of reasons for this. For some of us, it might be fear of rejection. It might be fear that we'll lose approval. It might be fear that somebody will be disappointed or even angry with us within our organization. And other times, we just love what we do and we love the person who's asking so much. We feel we're obligated to say yes to everything. But what happens in our career is we produce mediocre work when we say yes to things that are below the level at which we can perform with excellence. I've seen a lot of relationships absolutely destroyed, and I've seen a lot of time and energy and money wasted in companies because people had said yes to something that was not aligned with their highest level of skills, their talents and strengths. And what they did, although they were very well-meaning, is they held the company back and they cost the company a lot, and it hurt their reputation. When you say yes to things that you are uniquely suited to do, you are more likely to perform with excellence in each of these tasks, and that, more than anything, will move your career forward. And it also creates a feeling of scarcity. If you're not available for everything, when you are available for some things, your perceived value is so much greater. And finally, what qualities, abilities, and services account for my company's area of competitive advantage? And why are we superior? What exactly is it that we do? Not better. Better is ridiculous. What do we do that is different? How do you plan to upgrade your knowledge and skills? What are your products that are not producing the desired result? Or what are your services? Or what have you gotten into that knowing now if you knew then what you know now, you would choose to not get involved in again? And what have you done really well that's performed continuously? What products and services would perform better if you market them differently? And finally, do I resist temptation to clear up small things first? And if you had to go on holiday for 1 month, what one thing would you choose to complete? Now, a couple of things that helped me, because one of the hardest things that I've had to go through personally is working outside of an office. And sometimes when you work outside of an office, you get dragged up in your day-to-day activities and smaller tasks, and working out of a coffee shop or working out of a home office can be really difficult. But if you work inside a gym, you only get to do things that are urgent and important because you're usually interfacing with clients. But what about when things aren't acting upon you? What about the things that you need to act upon? And here's a couple of things that I have found helpful. Before starting any task, specify your desired outcome in writing and plan your activities, if possible, around the time when you're most effective. I used to, in my career, have to write 8 to 10 articles for publication every single month. Now, that's a lot. I even got sick of writing the articles because I got sick of hearing what I had to say on a continual basis, and I'm not really sure how other people were able to deal with it, quite honestly. But what I had to identify is that even though I was working on a really tight schedule and I had planned blocks of time, sometimes I just wasn't effective at doing some of the things. So even in odd hours, I designated those as the time when I was most creative and most effective, and get out of the office as much as possible to eliminate distractions and develop a compulsion for closure and reward systems for completing every task. Every time I complete a task, how do I recognize that and how do I positively reinforce that? And let me skip over this. Finally, one of the most important things in my career that has helped me is understanding continual professional growth and development. The website, PT on the Net, has done more to help me and help my team than almost any other resource I've ever used, because little tiny things you do daily compound to extraordinary value. For example, if I offered each of you on this call right now $1 million, euros, pounds, whatever your currency, to take with you tax-free straight away, or I offered you a single penny, but over the next 30 days, if you took my penny, I would double it every single day. Which would you choose? Now, many people emotively would say, well, the million, of course. But if you took the penny and I doubled it every single day, by day 2, you'd have 2 pennies. By day 3, you'd have 4. And by day 4, you'd have about 8 cents, and you'd hate me. However, if you allowed that to steadily compound, at the end of 30 days, you'd have over $5,300,000, euros, pounds, because that is the effect of compounding effort, doing little tiny things every single day that have extraordinary benefit over the long run. Earl Nightingale, in his book Leading the Field, stated that reading 1 hour each day contributed to much of his success as well. And think about this. Let's say you would read 1 hour per day. That could be 3 articles on PT on the Net. That's the equivalent of 50 books in a year within the average work week. This could be a minimum criteria. Trade publications, business books, business summaries also have an extraordinary value. And think about it. You'll spend anywhere from 500 to 1,000 hours per year commuting, whether that's on a bus, on a train, or in a car. And that's 3 to 6 months of a 40-hour work week, equaling 1 to 2 university semesters. So the greatest insight I've ever gotten in my career, which probably is most responsible for leading me to becoming an international speaker, is listen to audio programs incessantly and attend seminars. And let me give you this one method, because it's impossible to read everything. And some of the things that you read or you listen to or you scan through need to be chewed, it needs to be fully digested. Other things just need to be tasted and sipped in small increments because there might be something in that book or publication, but not everything, that's extraordinarily valued to you. So use the OPEER method. O stands for overview. This is when you could take a book out and read through its table of contents, the jacket, all the bold headings throughout the book, the first and last paragraph. This is almost a dialogue with the author answering the question, so what's this all about then? And from that answer, you could determine whether or not you want to put that book back or you want to explore it further. And you could do this with the books in your library as well. And this is a great way to use them as a continual resource. The next step is preview. This is where you flip through the pages quickly, relax, and don't read for total retention. Just preview and see, does anything jump out at you? In view is where you go back through each chapter and you highlight the points that you find most pertinent to you. In other words, very often the author will bold type or italicize key points within the text. This is what the author is communicating is extremely relevant. So if you go through the chapter headings and the subheadings, look underneath each subheading and find what's italicized or bold type and just highlight that. You can go through the main points in a book quite rapidly. As a matter of fact, maybe 3 times as expeditiously as you can just simply reading left to right, top to bottom, and going through an entire book front to cover. And because you're directing your mental focus to specific points of interest, you're utilizing your reticular activation system, which also upregulates your hippocampus, so you have much greater retention and recall of the information than going through and just reading without paying specific attention at that level. And then finally, review. Go back to the very first page of the book and read through the most important parts of the book carefully and ask yourself, very important, at the beginning, before you go through this process, what exactly you want to accomplish by reading a piece of material before you begin. This way, you don't read books. You get to literally dialogue with the author. Think about your favorite author. If you can sit in front of them and talk to them and have them answer questions, and if you've done this, you know that when you have a question and then you seek out authors, like on PT on the Net, who has basically some of the top authors in the fitness industry, and you can go through each article as if the author is answering a specific question that a client presented to you. Months later, you could have forgotten about that question, but someone can have the very same question, and almost always you'll be able to recall it because of the process you engaged in to learn it. As a matter of fact, Richard Boyd, who is the founder, the creator of PT on the Net, had that very intention in mind when he created PT on the Net. He was working in a studio, and he said, what if you could have a virtual expert, kind of like a hologram, following you around, and anytime anyone asked a question on any subject matter, this hologram contained all of the information of every top presenter and practitioner in the industry combined, and that person could be your personal mobile guru. Now, clearly, he didn't have the technology back then to create a hologram. That would be really cool, though. But he created PT on the Net. So at this point, I'm going to wrap up, hand it back, and say, if you're still hanging in there, thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much for attending today. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, you can email us at info@ptonthenet.com. I'm going to type that in the chat area. And we really appreciate you joining us. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy your time management. Bye-bye.